vous ne savez pas par où commencer ou comment continuer à apprendre le français, cette vidéo vous aidera avec ça. Bonjour à tous et bienvenue sur ma chaîne Language Travel Adoptee, and today I am talking about all of the things that I wish I had known and what I would do if I could start French over again this year. I have finally been able to maintain my B2 level in French after having stayed at the level of I can understand, but I cannot speak for a decade. I am not even joking, this was my very first foreign language in high school. By the way, if you want more confidence and clarity that lasts in your languages, make sure to check down in the comments below for joining the waitlist for the Mindful Multilinguals Collective. One of the big things I regret with French is that I relied on someone else. I thought this in the sense that I always had to use the resources that someone of a higher authority gave me. I had to finish them all the way through. I couldn't put those to the side in favor of finding different resources that worked for me better. And one of the first consequences of this was really falling into all or nothing thinking, black and white. Another consequence of this was having and defining my language success by someone else's or someone else's system's standards. I was the type of student that always kept her head down and did the work, but I was also heavily reliant on who was giving me the work and reliant on them to give me the motivation to keep on going. I also relied on them to set goals for me in terms of giving me quizzes, giving me exams, and being rewarded for it externally. That also led me to follow already set goals that didn't necessarily align with what I actually wanted to accomplish personally for me in French. Now, in the early stages of learning your first foreign language, you sometimes get so involved with how to acquire a language. You forget how personal this language learning journey is and how your own personality, behavioral patterns, life, will influence the pretty cookie cutter language learning tips that you might find online or what is already offered in a classroom. Be willing to look outside of the one thing you are 100% bent on making work for your learning. Because just because someone says a certain way of learning works for them does not mean that it will automatically work for you or that it'll work for you in every season of life that you're in. What I would have done with French, I would have self-studied it from the very beginning. I would have relied on what interested me the most, knowing that there's no right way to learn a language except for what works for you in the moment. Another thing I wish I knew before going into French was thinking that learning similar languages to French will then help me learn it better. This is probably a bit controversial considering that we hear a lot from others, and I've even said it sometimes on my channel, that learning similar languages are going to help you learn easier overall because they share so many traits already, and it'll be guaranteed to be easier for you. That's true to an extent, but I remember very clearly when, after having learned French in high school, I started learning Spanish and Italian, which I learned a lot faster than I did French. And even after learning those kinds of languages, even learning languages that maybe the US government would determine are even harder than French, such as German, I thought that there was something wrong with me once I returned to French and I still could not speak pretty much anything. I couldn't put sentences together. Ultimately, I blamed myself for still being stupid, and I started to feel like a fraud all over again. Once I did focus on listening more to my feelings of frustration, of overwhelm, and not just identify that they were there, but also processed the feelings that were lying even underneath those, and what past experiences in my life influenced them, I began to really more deeply understand the human that I was behind my languages, as well as the kind of language learner I was. And after gaining more clarity about myself and my needs as a human being in that way, as a product of that, I could ultimately gain more control over how I could make French work for me, instead of feeling like it was just tormenting me all the time and making me feel not good enough. So the real takeaway here is we pay attention so much to all these different language acquisition tips, instead of also paying equally as much attention to the life circumstances, emotions that are just as much a part of the language learning process. And the fact that, yes, emotions and our complicated relationships to our languages can definitely get in the way, as much as the lack of having a language study plan or feeling overwhelmed with resources can. What I would have done is be more self-reliant from the start, as I had said in my first point, and going in with the perspective that each new language is like a new relationship. So maybe there are similarities in between the languages, or you could also think of them as people, right? But they're never going to be exactly identical, and the approach is not going to look the exact same. In fact, it could be radically different, even for languages that we originally thought were similar. And again, to the similarity part, sure, there are similarities, but each new language, despite its similarities, will carry different circumstances. They might require you to show up in a different way to learn it, and you're going to have a different emotional connection to it. Another mistake that I made is I didn't speak to myself sooner, aka at all. So sure, I didn't speak for almost 8 or 9 months when I was learning German or Italian, and I was still successful in my own way, but I also didn't have such a strong, complicated emotional relationship with those languages like I did with French. If I could do it all over, I would definitely have started speaking in French to myself, maybe not immediately, but if not then at least within a year of learning it. Telling myself, yes, it is possible to learn how to speak even if I don't want to speak with other people or if they aren't available. Either by recording to myself, speaking to my pets, thinking to myself out loud, shadowing. There are so many strategies that exist without having to speak to real people. But I was so afraid of failure, I didn't even look up these strategies that would have helped me in the first place. Another thing I wish I didn't do was I listened only to teachers instead of including native sounding content, especially once I got into a more intermediate level. Listening primarily to teachers and relying on that as my main source of listening comprehension exercise, that was definitely a takeaway from school days. I just felt like I was never ready because I still couldn't speak French, so I continued to fool myself into just keeping my head down, doing the work as I said before. Of course, I could listen and understand teachers specifically because they spoke really clear, but watching a street interview or watching a movie in French, I could hardly understand anything. Now, I actually interpreted this as me failing. Instead of recognizing I simply wasn't expanding into new, more advanced territory with listening. What I would have done is listen to street interviews, any sort of more authentic content outside of teachers, and combining that with listening to more clear ways that teachers spoke. As I approached reaching an A2/B1 level studying on my own. As a beginner in language learning, I also thought that working on the key areas in an isolated way was the key to learning a language. So reading specifically goes here, listening goes here, speaking goes here. But I didn't realize the overlap that needed to happen in order to then live in the language more effectively like I had wanted all along. I also didn't realize how much listening really rounds out your speaking efforts, right? Because there's of course another person that is going to be on the other side of you listening, and you're going to have to listen to what they say back to you. Also, if you can identify certain pronunciations that are produced by someone else, really know them, identify them, and be able to repeat them back, that is again a wonderful way to round out your speaking experience through also concentrating on listening to more authentic content. Another thing that I wish I hadn't done is I listened to things only once, never repeating. And Français Authentique is a great podcast, but I definitely only relied on that because yes, Johan speaks in a very clean, concise manner. And I also relied on the teacher just speaking in class to us. So again, I wasn't diversifying what I was listening to. Again, if someone is talking to you in real time in the classroom, it's not like you can make them repeat. Especially when I started entering the intermediate level, there was a lot of vocabulary, the same vocabulary being repeated, the same ways to say the same things over and over, the same voices, right, that I habituated my ear to working with the same teacher. And this also gave me a false sense of security in my listening comprehension. So yes, I could understand what was being said in the classroom specifically. However, the degree to which I could understand others in different situations outside the classroom was even lower, which I never figured out until much later because I never repeated what I was listening to. And of course, avoided listening to varying audio in French. So what I would have done differently is I would have listened as much as I could to one select audio, having it play in the background, even doing chores perhaps like Peppa Pig if I had a lower level. At a higher level, I probably would have chosen a street interview on easy French that I enjoyed listening to and played that over and over. And as it went, practicing with the subtitles in the video how native speakers would maybe shorten phrases or repeat their intonation, repeat exactly what I heard them say, slang words that they used or any rhythms, and then copying them down in my digital flashcards afterwards with an audio option that I could add. Another thing I assumed, thinking the liaisons in French were going to be easy, and so I never actively worked on them in isolation. So what are liaisons? They are created by connecting the final sound of one word, which usually isn't pronounced, with the beginning sound of the following word. So for instance, in the phrase vous avez, the S at the end of vous is pronounced and is connected with the A in the beginning letter of avez. But including liaisons correctly is a must for accuracy. Now, I thought this would automatically just fix itself and that I just automatically get where liaisons went and what words used them. I just have to do, more active study of grammar points, basically doing anything outside of devoting actual time to actively know where liaisons went and practicing it. Again, when we have a lot of unspoken assumptions, they can actually carry us away from the goals, such as speaking, in my case, that we want. So now, 10 years later, it is still something that I question and know that, if I ever do take an exam or I go to a French-speaking country, it's something that I'm going to have to actively retrace my steps back to and improve, since I didn't do this at the beginning, and I definitely would have concentrated on this aspect of the language from day one. Now, I wish I really had not rushed the process. I focused continuously on the outcome instead of the process, which made me slow down, which then validated my limiting belief that I wasn't capable enough in French, that I wasn't good enough of becoming fluent. I wish I did intentionally slow down a little bit and let my learning process unfold exactly how it needs to on my own terms, in my own time, because if we think about, I want to reach fluency as a goal. What we really want is to improve our life in some way. And I wanted to improve my life, but by trying to push it and rush it always, I was continuously doing the opposite of what I thought my intention was, right? Of living that better life. Because life cannot be rushed. But I put an intense amount of self-pressure to do everything as fast as I could. But again, life and language learning can only be lived on our own rhythm, on our own time. If I had truly understood this, and the fact that yes, it was possible to integrate more of this philosophy into my own way of being in my language learning, I would have had a much less self-deprecating time learning French.